This is the miracle that I will never, ever forget.
Welcome to the Generation Now podcast. I'm here with Pastor Kent and Laura. Today we'll just be asking them a few questions. Started off with just a fun icebreaker. Does anyone here have a wow God moment?
I have a couple. So when I was around, we'll say 5 to 7 years old, I was messing around with a pillowcase trying to get it on my pillows, and I ended up dropping a nickel into the pillow. So I go searching for the nickel because it's like, well, that's my money as a child. Whatever coins you can get, that's like what you can get. And so I start digging through this pillowcase, and I throw it off eventually, and out slides a quarter. And so I go, wow, where did my nickel go? So I thank God for it, but it's like, but what the heck? So it's just a small funny thing I've had, and yeah. Go ahead.
So what exactly is a wow God moment?
It's kind of like either God did something in your life that was just like, wow, God, thanks. Or,
Oh, he's done lots of wow God things in my life. I think just the way that he began to work in my life and move me into a position where my heart's desire would be fulfilled. Mm-hmm. That's a wow God. But that took a number of years. But along the way, there were a lot of different steps that I took to prepare to be able to step into the place that he had prepared for me. So sometimes it's not an instantaneous kind of thing, but it's a series of steps, mm-hmm. a series of things that are like wow movements or wow moments where he intervenes in your life and positions you for where he wants you to be.
Mm-hmm. I guess my wow God moment is like finding this church, actually, because my family has been looking for one before we found this, so that'd probably be my answer.
You're definitely a blessing to have in the church.
Aw, thank you.
Yeah, so I guess we'll just start with some freelance questions. I think one of the first questions is, can you share a little bit of your testimony and how you got to the place you're at now?
Well, let's see. I was born.
We're glad you are.
Yeah, I was born. Long time ago. There weren't covered wagons at the time. It was a little bit after that. But I was born in Cave Spring, Virginia, and lived there until I was about 6 years old. I found out years later, after I started becoming involved in Living Word, that Pastor Mac actually lived in that same area years before. So I didn't know him at the time. He wouldn't have known me, but we knew neighbors. We had the same neighbors and that we knew.
Pastor, can you hold the mic closer, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
So that was kind of interesting, and that would have been back around 1958, 59, something like that. I was just a little kid. But he was older than me, so he was hanging out with the high school kids. But my father worked for Cargill out of Minneapolis, and so he was transferred every 2 years. And so every 2 years we would move. So we left Virginia, went to Kansas City. We were there for 2-3 years, and then we moved to Iowa, 2 different places. Then moved to Wisconsin, went to college in Wisconsin, and right toward the end of my time in Wisconsin, I enlisted in the Air Force. And so I served 4 years in the Air Force, came out, went to Florida, and that's where I had a real wow moment with God. I had already become a Christian years before, but that's where I was filled with the Spirit. And I went to a Bible school, Bible study in the top of someone's garage. They had made an area where they did Bible studies, and you could go up and pray, and it was kind of an outreach of a Baptist church. But these were people who were Baptist, but they were also filled with the Spirit, and they were beginning to move in the gifts of the Spirit. I was really fascinated by that. I had never even heard of anyone that spoke in tongues. And so I was invited to this Bible study one night, and one of the leaders approached me and asked if I would like to join them. They were going to have a little lesson and then pray together, and they wanted to know if I was already filled with the Spirit. And I said, no, I really don't know anything about it. My older sister, or my younger sister, actually had that experience a year before. And so she was telling me about it, but I still didn't really, from a scriptural standpoint, didn't really understand what the baptism of the Spirit was. And so I went to that Bible study that night, and then afterwards, as they said, they began to pray. And most of them were already filled with the Spirit. So they prayed for me, laid hands on me, and encouraged me to just speak out whatever was rolling around on the inside. And all that came out was ugga bugga. That was my tongue.
It's good enough.
Yeah. And it was a little frustrating because that went on for like 2 or 3 days. And I tried to yield myself as much as I possibly could. But 3 days after I was prayed for, all of a sudden it's like a river just began to flow. And then it was added on to the ugga bugga. And so I found myself for the first time beginning to hear the voice of God. So the more I yielded to that and prayed in my tongue, I would then get quiet and I could actually hear the voice of God. And he began to tell me some things that were surprising, very surprising. I had a really good job, paid really well. I could have retired probably by the age of 30. But the little voice that I began to hear told me to pack up my things and move to Minnesota. And I had no idea where I was going to go. I went into work the next day and gave them my resignation. I said, I'm going to resign. I'll only be here long enough to pack up my things and move to Minnesota. Long story short, my boss got really mad with me. He didn't want me to go, but I knew in my heart I couldn't stay there and get, just because of the pay. The pay was incredible at that time. I would have been making probably $125,000 or $150,000 a year. And back in the late 70s, that was a lot of money. So I turned it down and filled up a trailer and started coming to Minnesota. And while I was driving here, I got a call from my brother-in-law, who managed a golf course down in St. Peter, Minnesota. And he explained that he had a position opened. He just accepted the position of managing the country club. But he said, I need someone to kind of run the pro shop and help with the maintenance crew on the course. And so he said, I need someone right away. And I said, well, my trailer's loaded. I can just drive straight to where you are. And so that became the connection that got me to Minnesota. And then there were several others that were supernatural, where I crossed paths with Living Word when it was still very small. It was a Bible study of 12 people.
Can you explain how you got into the Bible study and like how you found out about it?
The one up here?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I had taken a part-time job because when the golf course closed down in the fall, I needed to have something to do. So I took a job in St. Peter, and it was working with ADT, which is a company that puts cable ends, like phone cables, that have the plugs on the end, or computer cables, things like that. That's what they did. They made those kinds of connectors. And across the bench from me, there was a guy that was a Christian, and we started carrying on conversations. And he was telling me about this church in the Twin Cities that had started up, and he had just found out about it. He heard really good things about it and wanted to know if I would be interested in going to that church. So that church was not Living Word. That church was Overcoming Faith Fellowship. And when I got there, I found out my brother-in-law and sister had actually been hired by the pastor to be children's ministers there. And they were coming up from Tulsa, from Rhema Bible Training Center. And I thought, this is so odd. Because God was doing in their life exactly what he was doing in my life, bringing all of us together to be at the same place. So shortly after I got involved in that church, they were children's pastors. The senior pastor of that church took a church out in Oakland, California. And what he decided to do, he said, I've got some other people that believe the same way we do. We're going to merge the two churches together. So the church that Pastor Mac and Lynn started was called Overcoming Faith Fellowship. And when they merged the two, then it became Living Word Christian Center. So that would have been back in the late 70s, early 80s. I think Living Word actually became a church. Initially, it was like a house church, and it grew to, they began to meet in a theater, in a hotel in Plymouth. That was their first step away from a house church. And then from there, they moved over here to 93rd and Aspen Lane. And that's when it became, really like a viable church. We had a sanctuary that was about this size. And so that church really began to grow. I was hired on in '83, in the summer of '83. And we just began to redo the building that we were in. It was a leased facility. And it was just growing leaps and bounds every year, doubling in size. And it got to the point we were really becoming, the facility was so used that we couldn't keep adding more things. We had to get into another facility. So that's when we found the property here and began to develop it out. And that's kind of a long story. But once I came on staff, one of the first things that I talked to Pastor Mac about was my heart for missions. And he said, well, we don't have missions right now. So
Not yet.
he said, if you'll just be faithful to do what I ask you to do, just serve wherever you can put your hand to the plow, just be faithful. And he said, I believe someday in the future that opportunity will open to you. Well, if I had known then what I know now, I probably would have left. But it took 12 years. And during the 12 years, I was moved from one place to another because as a young church, in a growing church, you're always adding new departments. So the first department I was over was ministering to singles because there were a lot of kind of between high school and college age people that were doing things, getting themselves in trouble. And Pastor Mac said, we need to draw them in and create some ministry for them to kind of help them out, especially in relationship issues and things like that. So I did that for about 2 years. And then there was an opportunity to step into evangelism. So that's before Pastor Nick came on staff. So we began to do evangelistic outreaches and create opportunities for all the people in the church to get involved. And then that grew to a point where there was a need for, I think at that point we got up to about 3,000 people in the church. So there was a real need for pastoral care, someone to do weddings and funerals. So I was like the wedding guy and the funeral director, all these other things. And as these individual opportunities opened to me, I kept thinking, well, when is missions going to be coming around? It seemed like it was taking forever. But now that I look back at it, all the things I learned in each of those areas of ministry actually prepared me for missions. So from the time I was hired on to the time I stepped into missions, it was actually 12 years. So I had gained a lot of experience doing a lot of different things. So then we began to put teams together, and we began to do, first couple of years, maybe 4 or 5 trips a year, but then after that it was 10 to 12 trips a year. So almost every month we were going out with a team somewhere. And so we did that for, until probably close to 25 years doing all that. So over those 25 years, and this is to answer Josh's question, we took teams probably to close to 100 countries, all over the world. I think the only continent we didn't go to was Antarctica, but I was working on it.
Do you still want to go to Antarctica?
Oh, I would love to. I would love to. We're getting close. The expense would be the challenge to get a team down there. But everywhere we went, God opened opportunities to us. Most of the time, I really had no idea where we were going to go until I prayed to the point He began to show me. And Brother Hagin used to talk about operating by the spirit of seeing and knowing. And so one of the things I realized, this is actually taking a little longer than I thought it would. One of the things I realized is that if I would be faithful to just spend time praying in tongues, I began to hear the Spirit of God speak to me about where He wanted to go, or where He wanted us to go, and what we would do. He would begin to fill in all the blanks, and we'd reach a point where we could then put a team together and go. So that kind of in a nutshell is kind of how missions started. We were still a growing church, and as long as the church is still growing, you're always adding different areas of ministry to that. So most of the people that started when the church was small had the same experience I did. They were just moved to other areas of ministry. But kind of an interesting way to be a part of a church. You get a lot of experience doing a lot of different things.
It's really cool how God kind of brought in a lot of different parts of your aspect or your life into these areas of your life now.
Yeah.
Okay, out of all the mission trips you've been on so far, which one has been your favorite?
That's really a hard question. Each trip is really unique. And I think what makes it unique is the people that you encounter. So I don't really there are places that I have enjoyed more than other places, but to be honest, all are very unique, and I have loved every one that I've gone on, just for a different reason. But the people, to me, I still remember faces of people that we've ministered to, especially people that received miracles that you weren't really expecting something to happen that happened as you were ministering to the people. And you see the expression on their face when the power of God heals their body. It changes their life forever. One of those trips was early on. This was actually before missions started. Some of the pastors were going on just some small missions trips down into South America. We had a couple in our church that joined the church, I think, in '85, and then they left in '87 to go back to their home country. So they were our first missionaries, and we sent them to Lima, Peru. So they invited several of us to come and minister down there, help do some things with the church, and then they would take us out like to Iquitos, which is a village in the jungle. They call it a village, but it's 500,000 people. Probably one of my favorite places, and it's because we saw the greatest miracles there. One of the miracles was we were having a service. Actually, Pastor Nick was there, and several other people from our church. But we had an evening service that was just so amazing. The pastor's daughter was pregnant. She actually looked like she was going to deliver on the platform that night. She was so far along. The guitarist that was accompanying her, she was singing alone. The guitar had several strings that had broken, and they're whipping around as he's playing. The drummer had one broken drumstick, and so he wasn't hitting the drums with both sticks necessarily at the same time. So everything just seemed so confused, and I was standing there waiting to go up on the platform to minister, and my first thought was, wow, this just doesn't seem like excellence of ministry. I knew from Pastor Mac's standpoint, he would really have a problem with that. But they were doing the best they could. And, I did appreciate the fact that they really, their hearts were so sincere, and it brought this presence. It was just really amazing. And so as worship is kind of ending, our missionary got up on the platform and introduced me to come up and speak. But there was still such a presence of God there. So I walked up on the platform and put my Bible on the podium, and I looked up, and all of a sudden the back of the room began to fill up like with a cloud, and it was moving. And as it moved closer and closer to the front, people that were standing along the aisles were falling out on the floor. No one was praying for them, and I didn't really understand what was going on. But as the cloud moved forward, it also began to, for lack of a better word, it became condensed. It all moved together and into the aisle coming up the middle of the sanctuary, and it began to spin. And as it got closer to the front, people are still falling out on the floor. And it came up and stopped right in front of the podium, and I could see the outline of a body inside the cloud. And the power of God was so thick. People were just falling out under the power everywhere in the room. There was a guy that was deaf, dumb, and paralyzed that was healed that night. So many other things that took place, and I was standing there wondering, how long is this going to go? What should I do? And I'm standing there, and all of a sudden, all the children that were in the room jumped up. They came up to the front and began to dance in a circle around the cloud. And the Lord spoke to me, and he gave me one scripture. And I had no idea what the scripture was at the time, what it said, but it was the 90th Psalm, verse 16. You can look it up if you want to. But it talks about how God would manifest himself to the people, and how he would make himself real to the children. But I didn't read that until we got out of that meeting that night. But there were so many supernatural things that happened. There was a couple of people from that same church that were at home that needed ministry. So the next day, we went to the home, and it was a lady that was laid out in a hospital bed, and the bed was set up in their dining room. All the furniture had been moved away, and her hospital bed was there. She was hooked up to wires and monitors and all kinds of things. She had some major heart problems, and the hospital just sent her home to die, basically. They couldn't help her. So we went in and introduced ourselves as, pastors from Minneapolis, and their pastor had asked us to come and pray for them. So this is why we're here. We want to lay hands on you and pray for you. And we laid hands on her, and maybe 30 seconds later, she lets out this big scream and starts pulling out all these cords and wires, things. The monitors are like going crazy. It's like red line, that kind of stuff. And we couldn't figure out why she was doing it, but what was happening is God was healing her body. And so everything was being healed, and she was so excited. She got out of bed, and she said, please go upstairs and minister to my mother. She's been in bed for 20 years, and she needs healing. And it's like, okay, we didn't know we were coming for your mother either. It's like, So we went upstairs and we just made a circle around her bed. And I'll never forget how she looked. I've never seen anyone that looked this gaunt, but it was basically like skin stretched over bone. There was very little muscle tissue. She actually did look like she was already dead, but her color was just ashen. She couldn't have weighed more than maybe 60 pounds at the most. So we knew she was very close to dying. And then this is the miracle that I will never, ever forget. You know what transformers are? You know, those things that just, you know, they turn into something that you're looking at it and all of a sudden it turns into something different. We laid hands on her, and within about 30 seconds, that's what happened to her body. It began to contort and twist, snap. The bone, you can hear this, the bone snapping and cracking, and her head was going back and forth like this. Her arms are going all over the place. And her daughter, the one that was healed downstairs a few minutes before, had to sit down. She was about ready to pass out. She didn't know what was happening to her mother. So we continued to lay hands on her, and I could actually see muscle tissue being added to her legs. And so being bedridden for 20 years, she literally had no muscle tissue at all. And so I'm watching this transformation take place, and all this tissue is being added to her legs and her arms and all over her body. And then she swings her legs down and jumps off the bed onto the floor and begins to walk. And it's like, I'll never, ever forget that miracle. So.
Can you tell us a little bit about like when you guys first started going into the ministry? Like how did that kind of start? Like was it over preparing, under preparing? Was it just like full on just trust in what God has planned and just go for it? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, I think because in the beginning of the church, Lynn Hammond pretty much led all the prayer groups. So we would pray with her almost every morning, the staff. And it got to be where she had so many different prayer meetings. She started one at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and it was called Morning Watch. And I absolutely loved that prayer group because she taught us by example how to hear the voice of God and how to step out in obedience to what He's telling you to do. And so having learned that, I realized that if we were going to be successful doing missions, that we would have to spend a lot of time praying because we had no connections with anyone anywhere. I mean, there was just nothing. So we had to pray those connections in. And so I decided that we would gather our first group, and this was the China trip that we took. And we started praying about China, and I suppose probably several months after praying, the Lord began to speak to us about some things very clearly. And the first thing he said to me was put a team together and go to China, go to Beijing, and I'll give you more instructions once you get there. Well, there were a lot of things to do. We had to order airline tickets. We had to get visas, which we had never gotten into China. China's a lot different than other countries. It's a communist country, so there's a lot of forms you have to fill out. Just things like that. Some people didn't even have their passports at that time. So everything had to be done and put together on this end, and we still had no connections on the other end. So we took off and landed in Beijing. We got up early the next morning and we met in one of the rooms and we just began to pray. And the first hour, there was a lot of praying in tongues. And then we took a little break. One of the girls, actually she's still on staff here, Karen Thompson was on that trip. And Karen came back to the room and she had a map that she had found in the nightstand by her bed, and she showed me, and it was like this map of Beijing. And as we were praying that first hour, I had seen a circle around the city of Beijing with little dots on the circle, on the ring, and it looked like someone had taken a match and burned holes where those dots were around that ring. When she opened up the map, I saw the little dots on there. And we began to look at it and see what it was, and it was subway stops. The subway went all the way around the city. And so these were all stops. And immediately when we realized that, the Spirit of God spoke to us, and he said, I want you to take the team, split it in half. Half the team goes to the subway stop, go one direction, the other half goes the other direction, meet on the other side of the city. And so, you know, we're trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to talk to these people about salvation through Christ? They're Chinese. We don't speak any Chinese. We just had to trust God. And we had a total peace about doing what we were doing. We had made up tracks that were actually in Chinese. Looking back, I probably wouldn't do that again, but because this was a supernatural thing, I figured we were covered. And so every subway stop, there was a supernatural connection. And the very first one, we had gone down by the train. It was preparing to leave the station. And I was looking around. There are just mobs of people getting on and off trains. Trains are going in and out of the station. And I look over, and two people that I see are walking toward the train, but they lit up like light bulbs. And I realized that there was something that God had given me to help me identify people that were ready to be prayed for. And so this first couple walks up, and I said, excuse me, do you speak English? And the man smiles, and he said, I speak perfect English, but he's Chinese. I said, what about your wife? Does she speak English? And she said, I speak perfect English too. I said, I'm just going to tell you why I'm here. We were praying several months ago, and the Lord told us to bring a team here to Beijing, and we were to come to the subway and begin ministering to people to receive Christ so that they know they have salvation through Christ. And he gets this smile on his face. And I said, would you like to know? He said, I would love to know. And so I prayed with both of them to receive Christ, and they prayed very willingly. And we had a couple of minutes before the train was going to pull out, and I asked him to tell me a little about himself. And it turned out he was the secretary of the Communist Party over Beijing, which is 25 million people. And it's like, oh my gosh. My first thought was, I hope he didn't turn me in, but train came in, they got onto the train, and it took off, and we waved goodbye to him. And he gave me his name, his phone number, how to contact him. And so I thought that was really different, that people we don't even know, that we meet for the first time, give us contact information in a communist country.
Have you ever contacted him?
Actually, the guy that helped us on the other end was already connected to the underground church. And in China, the underground church is huge. Probably by now they have 300 million that are in the underground church. It's a major force that the country doesn't know how to deal with. So yeah, we got names and phone numbers, contact information, all the people that we prayed with. But each place, it was so unique, and the team that went the other direction had the same experience. So by the time we finished that day, we had prayed with 51 people. All of them had totally different backgrounds, things like that. We gave all the contact information over to Mr. B, who is the contact. And the next time we went back to Beijing, we met Mr. B, and he began to tell us all these exciting stories about these people that he had met going into the underground church. He had contacted every one of them, and 50 of the 51 were already involved in the underground church. And so they're growing in their knowledge of the Bible. All kinds of things are happening in their lives. So to me, that makes China a really special place. We've had the Lord would just lead us to do some of the oddest things. Like they do reflexology and acupuncture and stuff like that. Our contact knew this lady that could help people on the team. Some of the people on the team were wanting to try acupuncture and some different things like that. And we had one guy on the team that actually, we were up on the Great Wall leading people to Christ, and he started to have some heart problems. And we didn't know he had any heart problems, but we got him back to the hotel as quickly as we could, and we called our contact's friend, who happened to be a doctor. She was an Army doctor for 40 years, but she specialized in acupuncture and those kinds of things. So she went to his room and began to use acupuncture and acupressure to cause the symptoms to be relieved. And after she finished, she said, "You'll be okay for probably the next month, but when you get home, you need to go see a cardiologist. You've got some issues you've got to deal with." But he was fine the rest of the trip, didn't have any symptoms. In fact, he felt so good, he decided not to go to a cardiologist. And then about 2 weeks after we got back, he had a heart attack. But he's okay, he lived. But we've seen so many miracles in China, and that's just one of the many places where we've seen lots and lots of miracles like that.
Well, thank you guys all for joining us on this podcast. See you next time.